Before we begin, if you enjoy documentaries like this, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support means a lot. Now, let's begin. For thousands of years, Mars was nothing more than a red light shining in the night sky. Ancient civilizations watched it move across the heavens and wondered what secrets it might hold. Some believed it was a symbol of war, while others thought it was a message from the gods. No one knew that one day human beings would attempt to stand on its surface. As centuries passed, our understanding of the universe grew. Telescopes revealed a mysterious world covered in deserts, giant volcanoes, frozen ice caps, and enormous canyons. Spacecraft crossed millions of kilometers to photograph its surface, while robotic rovers searched for evidence of ancient water and signs that life may once have existed there. The more we learned about Mars, the more one question refused to disappear. Could humans actually live there? The idea sounded impossible. Mars is one of the most dangerous places in the solar system. Its atmosphere is too thin to breathe. Temperatures can plunge far below freezing. Dangerous radiation constantly bombards the surface. Massive dust storms can cover huge portions of the planet. Everything about Mars seems designed to keep humanity away. Yet throughout history, humans have always been drawn toward impossible frontiers. We crossed unknown oceans, explored frozen continents, and climbed mountains once thought unreachable. Every generation faced a challenge that seemed beyond human capability. For our generation, that challenge became Mars. Scientists spent decades developing technologies that could transform a dream into reality. Engineers designed spacecraft capable of carrying people farther than any human had ever traveled before. Researchers created systems to recycle water, generate oxygen, and support life in the harshest environments imaginable. Slowly, year after year, the impossible became possible. Entire careers were dedicated to solving the countless problems standing between humanity and another world. Then, after decades of preparation, testing, failures, improvements, and breakthroughs, the announcement finally arrived. Humanity would attempt its first crewed mission to Mars. The news spread across the globe. Millions followed every update. Children dreamed about becoming future explorers. Scientists celebrated a milestone many thought they would never see in their lifetimes. For the first time in history, humanity was preparing to become an interplanetary species. This would not simply be another space mission. It would be one of the most ambitious undertakings ever attempted. The astronauts selected for the mission understood the risks better than anyone. They knew that once they left Earth, help would be millions of kilometers away. Every system would have to function perfectly. Every decision could mean the difference between life and death. Yet despite the dangers, they volunteered. Because opportunities like this come only once in history. Launch day finally arrived. The massive rocket stood on the launch pad beneath the morning sky, surrounded by engineers, technicians, and reporters. Across the world, billions watched as the countdown began. The astronauts sat inside the spacecraft knowing that everything they had worked toward was about to become reality. As the final seconds ticked away, humanity stood at the edge of a new era. The engines ignited. Flames erupted beneath the rocket. The ground shook with tremendous force. Slowly at first, then faster and faster, the spacecraft rose into the sky. At that moment, humanity's greatest journey had begun. As the rocket climbed higher into the sky, millions of people around the world watched in complete silence. Some stood in crowded city squares. Others sat in classrooms, offices, and living rooms. Everyone understood they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered for generations. Inside the spacecraft, however, there was no time to think about history. The astronauts were focused entirely on the mission. Every screen displayed critical information. Fuel levels, engine temperatures, navigation systems, communication links, and life support equipment were being monitored every second. The vibration from the engines was intense. The force pressing the crew into their seats made even simple movements difficult. Yet despite the overwhelming power surrounding them, everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Within minutes, the rocket accelerated beyond the speed of sound. Soon afterward, it passed through the upper layers of Earth's atmosphere. Outside the windows, the familiar blue sky slowly began to disappear. The darkness of space emerged above them. It was a sight few people in human history had ever witnessed firsthand. Then came the first major milestone. The massive booster stage separated from the rocket. With a powerful mechanical jolt, the empty section detached and began falling back toward Earth while the remaining engines continued pushing the spacecraft higher. The mission was working. Thousands of engineers who had spent years preparing for this moment finally allowed themselves a brief moment of relief. But there was still a long way to go. The spacecraft continued accelerating until it finally reached orbit around Earth. Suddenly, the engines shut down. The violent shaking stopped. Silence filled the cabin. For a brief moment, everything felt strangely calm. Pens began floating through the air. Checklists drifted away from their storage locations. The astronauts felt weightless as they entered microgravity. Even after years of training, the experience never felt completely normal. Some crew members immediately looked through the windows. Below them was Earth. A beautiful blue sphere floating alone in the darkness. White clouds stretched across continents. Oceans reflected sunlight. From this distance, there were no borders, no countries, and no signs of the conflicts that often divided humanity. There was only one fragile world. Many astronauts throughout history described this view as life-changing. It often created a powerful realization that every human being who had ever lived shared the same tiny planet. Every war, every invention, every city, every civilization existed on that single world below. Yet for the crew of the Mars mission, Earth was no longer their destination. It was now the place they were leaving behind. Over the next several hours, the astronauts prepared for the most important maneuver of the mission so far. Reaching orbit was impressive, but it was only the beginning. Their true destination remained millions of kilometers away. Mission Control carefully reviewed every calculation. The timing had to be perfect. A mistake of only a few seconds could send the spacecraft far off course. Eventually, the final confirmation arrived. Everything was ready. The astronauts returned to their seats and secured themselves for the next engine burn. Unlike previous burns, this one would change the course of the entire mission. Once the engines ignited, the spacecraft would leave Earth's orbit and begin its journey toward Mars. There would be no turning back. No quick return home. No rescue mission waiting nearby. For the first time in human history, human beings were about to travel toward another planet. As the countdown began, the crew exchanged brief glances. They all understood what this moment meant. The engines ignited once more. The spacecraft accelerated. Earth slowly began falling behind. Humanity's first voyage to Mars had truly begun. At first, very little seemed different. The spacecraft was moving faster than any commercial aircraft ever built, yet from inside the cabin there was no sensation of speed. There was no wind. No sound from outside. No visible motion. Only the instruments on the screens revealed the incredible reality. Every second, the crew was traveling farther away from Earth. As the hours passed, the blue planet that had filled the windows began to shrink. The astronauts found themselves returning again and again to look at it. For their entire lives, Earth had been everything. Every memory, every friend, every family member, every place they had ever known existed on that distant sphere. Now it was becoming smaller with every passing hour. During previous space missions, astronauts always knew they would eventually return home. The moon missions lasted only days. Missions aboard space stations remained relatively close to Earth. Even if problems occurred, rescue was often possible. This mission was different. The crew was entering a region of space where no human beings had ever traveled before. Every kilometer carried them farther from home than any member of their species had ever been. At first, Earth still appeared large enough to see continents and cloud formations. Then it became a brilliant blue marble. Days later, it looked no larger than a bright star. Some astronauts admitted years later that this was the moment when the reality of the mission truly struck them. Mars still seemed distant. But Earth was already disappearing. Communication with mission control continued, but even that began to change. Signals now required noticeable amounts of time to travel between Earth and the spacecraft. Questions were no longer answered instantly. Conversations became slower. The crew was beginning to experience what future generations of deep space explorers would consider normal. Distance was creating separation. Meanwhile, life inside the spacecraft settled into a routine. Every day followed a carefully planned schedule. Exercise became one of the most important activities on board. Without gravity, muscles and bones gradually weaken. The astronauts spent hours each day running, cycling, and performing resistance exercises simply to maintain their physical health. Scientific experiments filled much of the remaining time. Researchers on Earth were eager to learn how the human body and mind would respond to such a long mission. Every measurement could help future explorers survive even farther from Earth. Yet despite the busy schedule, there were moments when the crew found themselves staring out the windows into the darkness. Space between planets is unimaginably empty. There are no landmarks. No nearby worlds. No signs of civilization. Only endless darkness stretching in every direction. Some found the view peaceful. Others found it unsettling. The silence of deep space had a way of making people feel very small. Weeks passed. Then months. Earth continued shrinking behind them while Mars slowly grew ahead. The astronauts were suspended between two worlds, belonging fully to neither one. They had left Earth, yet they had not reached Mars. They existed in a strange place between humanity's past and its future. It was during this period that many members of the crew began understanding the true meaning of the mission. They were not simply traveling to another planet. They were participating in one of the most important transitions in human history. If they succeeded, humanity would no longer be a species confined to a single world. For the first time, civilization would exist on more than one planet. But that future depended on surviving the journey ahead. And deep space was about to reveal challenges far more dangerous than anyone expected. As the days blended into weeks and the weeks blended into months, the excitement of launch day slowly faded into routine. The crew had entered a phase of the mission that many experts considered one of the most difficult. There were no dramatic landings, no breathtaking discoveries, and no historic moments for the cameras. Instead, there was only time. Endless amounts of time. Every morning began with the same schedule. System checks. Medical examinations. Exercise sessions. Scientific experiments. Equipment inspections. Then the process would repeat again the next day. At first, the structure felt comforting. It provided purpose and stability. But as the mission continued, the monotony became impossible to ignore. Human beings evolved on a living world filled with constantly changing environments. We are accustomed to weather, seasons, landscapes, sounds, and movement. Inside the spacecraft, none of those things existed. The same walls surrounded the crew every day. The same equipment. The same corridors. The same faces. There were no fresh smells, no changing scenery, and no opportunities to step outside. The astronauts began missing things they had never appreciated before. The feeling of wind. The sound of rain. The warmth of sunlight on their skin. The smell of grass after a storm. These ordinary experiences suddenly felt incredibly valuable. Psychologists had predicted this would happen. They understood that long-term isolation could become one of the greatest threats to the mission. A mechanical failure might be repaired. A damaged component might be replaced. But problems inside the human mind were far more difficult to solve. Some crew members became quieter than usual. Others spent long periods looking at photographs from home. Small disagreements occasionally emerged over issues that would normally seem insignificant. A misplaced tool. A misunderstood comment. A minor scheduling conflict. In the confined environment of a spacecraft, even small frustrations could grow over time. The crew worked hard to manage these challenges. They understood that teamwork was essential for survival. There was no escape from one another. Every person on board depended on everyone else. Meanwhile, another invisible danger surrounded them every second. Radiation. On Earth, humanity is protected by a powerful magnetic field and a thick atmosphere. Together, these natural shields block much of the dangerous radiation constantly traveling through space. Out here, those protections no longer existed. High-energy particles from the Sun and distant cosmic events passed through the spacecraft every day. Most caused no immediate harm. But over months and years, exposure could increase the risk of cancer, damage tissues, and affect the nervous system. The spacecraft had shielding, but it could never provide the same level of protection as Earth itself. Every day spent in deep space carried a cost. Yet despite the dangers, the mission continued. The crew adapted. Humans are remarkably capable of adjusting to difficult circumstances. Over time, the astronauts developed new routines and traditions. They celebrated birthdays, shared meals, watched recorded messages from family members. Occasionally they gathered near the windows simply to observe the stars. Without Earth's atmosphere, the view was extraordinary. Countless stars filled the darkness. Some appeared brighter than anything visible from Earth's surface. The Milky Way stretched across space in breathtaking detail. It was beautiful. But it was also a reminder of how isolated they truly were. They were no longer part of Earth's environment. They were travelers crossing an ocean of darkness between worlds. Then one day, after months of seeing little change outside the spacecraft, something different appeared. Ahead of them, a small red point began growing larger. At first it seemed insignificant. But with each passing day, it became easier to see. Mars was no longer just a destination in a flight plan. It was becoming a real world waiting in the darkness. For the crew, that sight changed everything. The long journey was finally approaching its end. Soon they would attempt something no human being had ever done before. They would try to land on another planet. And everyone on board understood one terrifying fact. The most dangerous part of the mission was still ahead. By the time Mars became clearly visible ahead of them, the crew had already spent months inside a machine no larger than a small apartment. From Earth, people often imagine space travel as an exciting adventure filled with constant discoveries and breathtaking views. The reality was very different. Most days were surprisingly ordinary. The astronauts woke up at the same time every morning. They followed strict schedules designed years before launch. Every hour had a purpose. Every task had been carefully planned. There was little room for spontaneity. Life support systems needed constant monitoring. Scientific experiments had to be completed. Exercise routines could not be skipped. Equipment required regular inspections. Even simple activities took longer than expected in microgravity. Something as basic as drinking water or eating a meal required attention and care. Water floated in small spheres if it escaped its container. Tiny crumbs could drift into sensitive equipment and create problems. Every action inside the spacecraft had consequences. Privacy was almost non-existent. The crew lived, worked, ate, exercised, and slept within a very limited space. There were no long walks outside. No private bedrooms. No opportunities to spend an afternoon alone. For months, the same people saw each other every single day. Mission planners knew this would be challenging. Before launch, every astronaut underwent extensive psychological evaluations. The goal was not simply to find intelligent people. It was to find individuals capable of remaining calm, cooperative, and emotionally stable under extraordinary pressure. Fortunately, the crew performed remarkably well. They developed routines that helped maintain morale. Shared meals became important social events. Small celebrations helped mark the passing of time. Birthdays, holidays, and mission milestones provided opportunities to break the monotony. Yet despite their efforts, there were moments when homesickness became impossible to ignore. Many astronauts spent time looking at photographs from Earth. Some listened to recordings from family members. Others watched videos of places they loved. The simple sight of oceans, forests, cities, and mountains suddenly carried enormous emotional weight. For perhaps the first time in their lives, they fully appreciated how extraordinary Earth truly was. The crew also discovered something unexpected. Over time, the spacecraft itself began to feel like a living environment. Every sound became familiar. The constant hum of fans. The quiet operation of life support systems. The occasional clicks and vibrations from equipment. When a sound changed unexpectedly, everyone noticed immediately. The spacecraft was not just transportation. It was their entire world. Everything keeping them alive existed within its walls. Beyond those walls stretched a vacuum capable of killing them within seconds. This reality was impossible to forget. Yet humans possess a remarkable ability to adapt. What initially felt strange gradually became normal. Weightlessness became routine. Floating through corridors became second nature. Daily life settled into a rhythm. The crew learned to focus on the mission rather than the distance separating them from Earth. But while life inside the spacecraft appeared stable, a much greater challenge was slowly developing. The farther they traveled from Earth, the more isolation began affecting the human mind. And soon, the crew would discover that surviving the journey required far more than functioning technology. It required surviving themselves. Long before the mission launched, scientists knew that one of the greatest dangers would not come from Mars, radiation, or mechanical failures. It would come from the human mind. For months, the crew had lived inside the same spacecraft, surrounded by the same walls, following the same routines, and seeing the same people every day. At first, discipline and excitement helped keep morale high. But as the journey continued, subtle changes began to appear. Some astronauts became quieter. Others spent more time alone. Conversations that once felt natural required more effort. The human brain evolved in a world filled with constant stimulation. Throughout history, people experienced changing landscapes, weather, sounds, and social interactions. Deep space offered none of those things. There were no sunsets. No fresh air. No crowds. No unexpected events. Every day felt remarkably similar to the one before it. Psychologists call this phenomenon sensory monotony, and it can have powerful effects on human behavior. Small frustrations become larger. Minor disagreements become harder to ignore. The crew understood this and worked hard to prevent problems before they grew. They maintained regular communication with psychologists on Earth. They participated in group activities. They encouraged one another to talk openly about stress and anxiety. Even so, there were moments when the isolation felt overwhelming. Looking out a window and seeing nothing but endless darkness could be both beautiful and unsettling. The stars were magnificent, but they also served as a reminder of how far away home had become. Earth was no longer a world visible in the sky. It had become a distant point of light among countless others. For some crew members, that realization was difficult to process. Messages from family helped, but even communication had changed. The increasing distance between Earth and the spacecraft meant that conversations were no longer immediate. Questions could take many minutes to receive a reply. Sometimes the delay felt small. Other times it felt enormous. The crew was beginning to experience a level of separation no human beings had ever known before. Sleep also became a challenge. Without a natural day-night cycle, the body often struggled to maintain normal rhythms. Some astronauts found themselves waking unexpectedly. Others experienced vivid dreams about Earth. Memories became unusually powerful. Ordinary experiences from childhood suddenly returned in remarkable detail. The smell of a favorite meal. Walking through a familiar neighborhood. Listening to rain against a window. These memories reminded the crew of everything they had left behind. Yet despite the psychological challenges, the mission continued. The astronauts adapted just as humans always have. They supported one another. They remained focused on their goals. And most importantly, they never forgot why they were there. They were not simply traveling to Mars for themselves. They represented all of humanity. Every challenge they overcame would help future generations travel farther into space. Every lesson they learned would make future missions safer. Slowly, the crew began finding a new balance. The isolation never disappeared completely, but they learned how to live with it. Their minds adapted to the strange reality of deep space. They became stronger, more resilient, and more capable than anyone had expected. But while the psychological challenges were significant, another danger was growing around them every second. It was invisible. Silent. Impossible to see with the naked eye. And unlike loneliness, it could not be overcome through determination alone. Its name was radiation. Unlike most dangers faced by the crew, radiation could not be seen, heard, touched, or smelled. There were no warning signs. No flashing alarms. No visible clouds of energy surrounding the spacecraft. Yet every second of the journey, high-energy particles were passing through the darkness of space at nearly the speed of light. On Earth, humanity is protected by two powerful shields. The first is our atmosphere, which absorbs much of the harmful radiation coming from space. The second is Earth's magnetic field, which deflects many dangerous charged particles before they ever reach the surface. Together, these natural defenses have protected life for millions of years. But once the astronauts left Earth, those protections disappeared. They entered an environment where cosmic radiation became a constant companion. Some of these particles originated from the Sun. Others traveled across the galaxy from distant supernovas and other violent cosmic events. Many had been moving through space for millions of years before finally colliding with the spacecraft. Every impact released tiny bursts of energy. Most passed harmlessly through the vehicle. Some passed directly through the astronauts themselves. Scientists had spent decades studying this threat. They knew that long-term exposure could damage DNA, increase the risk of cancer, affect the nervous system, and potentially cause health problems that might not appear for years. The spacecraft included specialized shielding designed to reduce the danger, but no practical shield could block everything. Every day spent in deep space added a little more exposure. The crew understood the risks long before launch. They accepted them because exploration has always involved danger. Sailors crossing unknown oceans faced storms and disease. Early pilots risked mechanical failure every time they left the ground. The first astronauts accepted risks that few people would willingly face. Mars explorers were no different. Yet knowing about radiation and living with it were two very different experiences. Periodically, the crew monitored radiation levels throughout the spacecraft. Most days the readings remained within expected limits. But there was always concern about solar storms. Occasionally, the Sun releases enormous eruptions of energy capable of flooding space with dangerous particles. A sufficiently powerful event could expose astronauts to radiation levels high enough to cause immediate health problems. Mission planners had prepared for this possibility. A heavily shielded section of the spacecraft served as an emergency shelter. If a major solar storm occurred, the crew would move inside and remain there until the danger passed. Fortunately, during most of the journey, the Sun remained relatively calm. Even so, radiation remained a constant reminder that deep space was fundamentally different from life on Earth. The crew was traveling through an environment where survival depended entirely on technology. A failure of shielding, life support systems, or communications could quickly become catastrophic. Yet despite these dangers, the astronauts continued their work. They performed experiments, maintained equipment, exercised daily, and prepared for the challenges awaiting them on Mars. Over time, they learned to live with the invisible threat surrounding them. It became another part of daily life in deep space. But as the mission progressed, something else began changing. The red dot ahead of them was no longer just a distant point of light. Week after week, Mars was growing larger. For the first time, the crew could begin making out details on its surface. The world they had spent years dreaming about was finally coming into view. And with every passing day, humanity moved one step closer to setting foot on another planet. One of the strangest parts of the mission was not the launch, the isolation, or even the radiation. It was watching Earth slowly disappear. During the first few days after leaving orbit, the planet still dominated the view behind them. The astronauts could easily recognize continents, swirling cloud systems, and the deep blue oceans that covered most of the surface. It looked alive. Familiar. Safe. Every crew member found excuses to look out the windows. Some spent long periods simply staring at the world they had called home for their entire lives. There was something almost impossible about seeing Earth from that distance. Every person they had ever known was down there. Every city. Every language. Every nation. Every piece of human history. Everything humanity had ever accomplished existed on that single sphere floating through the darkness. Yet day by day, the view changed. Earth became smaller. Details disappeared. Continents vanished first. Then cloud patterns became difficult to see. Eventually the oceans could no longer be distinguished. The planet that once filled the window became nothing more than a bright blue-white marble. The crew continued checking on it every day. It became a ritual. A reminder of home. But the shrinking planet also served as a reminder of distance. Every hour that passed carried them farther away. Every kilometer traveled made a return journey more difficult. Unlike previous astronauts, they were not circling Earth. They were leaving it. The realization affected each crew member differently. Some became more reflective. Others focused even harder on work. A few admitted feeling an unexpected sadness as Earth faded into the background. They had trained for years, yet no training could fully prepare someone for seeing their entire world become a tiny object in space. As weeks passed, Earth continued shrinking. Eventually it looked no different from a bright star. The astronauts knew which point of light was home, but identifying it became increasingly difficult. Looking through the spacecraft windows, countless stars filled the darkness. Somewhere among them was Earth. Somewhere on that distant point of light, billions of people were continuing their daily lives completely unaware of how strange and lonely deep space could feel. The crew still received messages from family and friends, but even those communications felt different now. The delays grew longer. Conversations lost their natural rhythm. Sometimes a simple exchange required many minutes. The distance between Earth and the spacecraft was becoming impossible to ignore. Yet there was another side to this experience. As Earth disappeared behind them, Mars grew larger ahead. The destination that had once existed only in simulations and mission plans was becoming real. The astronauts found themselves spending more time looking forward instead of backward. The future was no longer a distant concept. It was visible through the windows. A red world hanging in the darkness. Every day, Mars appeared slightly larger than before. Surface features slowly became visible. Dark regions, bright regions, and enormous geological formations emerged from the red disk. The crew began studying it constantly. They reviewed maps, landing procedures, and emergency plans. Excitement gradually replaced nostalgia. For the first time, humanity was approaching another planet not as observers, but as future inhabitants. Yet while Mars was growing larger, another challenge was quietly approaching as well. The closer they came to their destination, the more pressure the crew felt. Months of preparation had led to this moment. Soon they would attempt the most dangerous landing in human history. And there would only be one chance to get it right. For months, the mission had proceeded remarkably well. The spacecraft was functioning as expected, the crew remained healthy, and Mars continued growing larger ahead. From the outside, everything appeared perfect. But space has a way of reminding explorers that perfection rarely lasts forever. The first major challenge began with something so small that nobody noticed it at first. A sensor deep inside one of the spacecraft's environmental control systems started producing inconsistent readings. At first the fluctuations seemed insignificant. Electronic systems occasionally behaved unpredictably, especially after months in space. Engineers on Earth reviewed the data and concluded that the issue was probably harmless. The crew continued their routine. But over the following days, the problem became more noticeable. Readings that should have remained stable began changing unexpectedly. Backup systems showed different values. Nobody could immediately determine whether the problem was a faulty sensor or a genuine malfunction. In a normal building on Earth, such a problem would have been inconvenient. In deep space, it was potentially life-threatening. Every system onboard the spacecraft existed for a reason. Oxygen production, carbon dioxide removal, temperature regulation, water recycling, and power generation were all essential for survival. A failure in any one of them could place the entire mission at risk. The crew immediately began diagnostic procedures. Hours turned into days as they carefully inspected equipment, compared data, and searched for the source of the problem. Mission control assisted from Earth, but the growing communication delay complicated everything. What once would have been solved in minutes now required long exchanges of messages and instructions. The astronauts quickly realized an important truth. The farther humanity travels from Earth, the more responsibility falls on the explorers themselves. There would be no emergency repair team arriving from home. There would be no rescue mission waiting nearby. If something broke, they had to fix it. Eventually, after extensive investigation, the crew discovered the cause. A small component inside the environmental control system had begun degrading faster than expected. It was not an immediate disaster, but it was a warning. Space was slowly wearing down the technology keeping them alive. Every day exposed equipment to vibration, temperature fluctuations, radiation, and countless other stresses. The astronauts replaced the damaged component using spare parts carried on board. The repair worked. System readings returned to normal. The immediate danger passed. Yet the incident left a lasting impression on everyone involved. For the first time, the crew experienced what future Mars settlers would face regularly. Technology was no longer a convenience. It was the difference between life and death. On Earth, people rarely think about the systems surrounding them. Electricity flows from outlets. Clean water arrives from taps. Fresh air is always available. On Mars and in deep space, nothing can be taken for granted. Every breath depends on machinery. Every meal depends on technology. Every moment of survival depends on systems functioning exactly as intended. The challenge also strengthened the crew's confidence. They had faced a serious problem and solved it. Their training had worked. Their teamwork had worked. For the first time, they truly began seeing themselves not merely as astronauts, but as pioneers. Yet while the malfunction had been resolved, a much larger challenge was approaching. Ahead of them, Mars now appeared enormous. Surface details were clearly visible. The planet no longer looked distant. It looked real. Very soon, the crew would begin preparations for the most dangerous phase of the entire mission. Landing on Mars. A maneuver so difficult that even robotic missions had often failed. And unlike those machines, human lives would be riding aboard this one. After hundreds of days in deep space, the moment the crew had imagined for years finally arrived. Mars was no longer a distant red dot among countless stars. It was now a world. A real planet hanging outside the windows of the spacecraft. Every day it appeared larger than before. Surface details that had once been invisible were now impossible to ignore. Dark regions stretched across vast deserts. Massive impact craters scarred the landscape. Dust storms drifted across entire sections of the planet. For the first time, the astronauts could see the destination that had dominated their lives for so many years. The atmosphere inside the spacecraft changed almost immediately. The long journey through deep space was coming to an end. Every conversation now focused on arrival procedures. Every simulation centered on landing operations. Every crew member understood that months of preparation were about to be tested. Mars looked beautiful from a distance, but everyone on board knew the truth. It was also one of the most dangerous places humans had ever attempted to visit. Unlike Earth, Mars could not forgive mistakes. There would be no breathable air waiting outside. No oceans. No forests. No natural protection from radiation. Survival would depend entirely on technology. Yet despite the dangers, excitement filled the spacecraft. The crew had spent months traveling through darkness toward a destination that few people throughout history ever believed humanity would reach. Now it was directly ahead of them. Some astronauts spent hours simply staring through the windows. They watched sunlight reflect from the planet's thin atmosphere. They observed enormous canyons cutting across the landscape. They studied the towering volcanoes that rose from the surface. Olympus Mons, the largest volcano in the solar system, appeared almost unreal in scale. It stood nearly 3 times taller than Mount Everest. Nearby lay Valles Marineris, a canyon system so large that it could stretch across an entire continent on Earth. Everything about Mars seemed larger, harsher, and stranger than anyone had imagined. As the spacecraft moved closer, the crew began receiving increasingly detailed data from orbiting satellites already circling the planet. Weather conditions were analyzed. Dust activity was monitored. Landing zones were carefully evaluated. Engineers on Earth reviewed every possible scenario. The landing would have to be nearly perfect. Unlike missions to the Moon, Mars presented a unique problem. Its atmosphere was too thin to slow a spacecraft efficiently using parachutes alone. Yet it was thick enough to create enormous heat during entry. This dangerous combination had challenged every Mars mission ever attempted. Engineers often described landing on Mars as trying to hit a specific target while traveling thousands of kilometers per hour through a hostile atmosphere. A small mistake could be catastrophic. The crew understood this better than anyone. Yet nobody wanted to turn back. In fact, the closer they came, the more determined they became. Years of training, sacrifice, and preparation had led to this moment. Humanity was standing at the edge of a new frontier. For thousands of years, Mars had existed only as a mystery in the sky. Now human beings were about to touch it. As the planet filled more and more of the windows, one realization became impossible to ignore. The journey through deep space was ending. The most dangerous part of the mission was beginning. Within days, the spacecraft would enter the Martian atmosphere. And from that moment forward, there would be no second chances. As Mars continued growing larger outside the spacecraft windows, the mood on board began to change. The excitement of arrival was still there, but it was now mixed with something else. Tension. Every astronaut understood that the mission was approaching its most dangerous phase. Reaching Mars was difficult. Landing on Mars was even harder. Throughout history, many spacecraft had successfully traveled millions of kilometers across space only to fail during the final minutes of their journey. Engineers often referred to those moments as the 7 minutes of terror. The phrase existed for a reason. During atmospheric entry, everything would happen incredibly fast. There would be little time to react and almost no opportunity to correct major mistakes. Once the process began, the crew would be committed. Every system on board the spacecraft was checked repeatedly. Navigation computers were tested. Landing engines were inspected. Backup systems were verified. The astronauts practiced emergency procedures over and over again. By now they knew every step from memory. If something went wrong, hesitation could be fatal. Meanwhile, engineers on Earth continued analyzing enormous amounts of data. Weather conditions near the landing site were monitored constantly. Wind speeds were measured. Dust activity was tracked. Scientists wanted the safest conditions possible, but Mars rarely cooperated. The planet was famous for unpredictable weather and sudden dust storms. Even a small change in conditions could complicate the landing. Inside the spacecraft, the crew prepared mentally as much as physically. They reviewed maps of the landing zone. They studied satellite images. They discussed contingency plans. Everyone knew what was at stake. This was no longer a simulation. This was reality. For years, people across Earth had imagined the moment when humans would finally reach Mars. Soon that moment would either become history or tragedy. As the final days passed, sleep became more difficult. Not because the astronauts were afraid, but because anticipation made rest nearly impossible. They had spent years working toward this goal. Some had dedicated most of their adult lives to it. Now the destination was directly outside the window. Every time they looked at Mars, they saw the future. They saw the first human settlement beyond Earth. They saw the beginning of a new chapter in civilization. But before any of that could happen, they first had to survive the landing. The spacecraft slowly adjusted its trajectory. Small engine burns positioned it for atmospheric entry. Everything had to be calculated with extraordinary precision. Enter too steeply and the spacecraft could overheat or crash. Enter too shallowly and it could skip off the atmosphere entirely and drift back into space. There was only a narrow path to success. Mission Control sent one final series of instructions. The crew acknowledged them and began preparing for entry. Soon communication delays would make real-time assistance impossible. For a while, the astronauts would be on their own. They secured equipment throughout the cabin. Loose objects were stored away. Seats were prepared. Emergency procedures were reviewed one final time. Then, for a brief moment, everything became quiet. The crew looked out the windows. Below them stretched an entire world waiting to be explored. Endless deserts. Ancient river valleys. Towering volcanoes. A landscape untouched by human footsteps. Somewhere down there was the landing site. The place where history would be made. The place where humanity would attempt to build its first home on another planet. But first, they had to survive the descent. And in just a few hours, they would enter the atmosphere of Mars at thousands of kilometers per hour. From that moment onward, every second would matter. The day had finally arrived. After traveling hundreds of millions of kilometers through space, humanity's first crewed mission to Mars was only minutes away from the most dangerous maneuver ever attempted by human explorers. Everything that had happened so far, the launch, the journey through deep space, the months of isolation, had all led to this moment. Inside the spacecraft, the crew sat strapped into their seats. No one spoke very much. There was little left to say. Years of training had prepared them for what was about to happen. Now all they could do was trust the technology, trust their training, and trust each other. Outside the windows, Mars filled nearly the entire view. The red desert stretched endlessly beneath them. Ancient craters scarred the landscape. Massive dust storms swirled across distant regions of the planet. It was beautiful. And terrifying. The spacecraft continued accelerating toward the atmosphere. Soon it would encounter the thin layer of gases surrounding Mars. Although much weaker than Earth's atmosphere, it was still powerful enough to create enormous friction. Within minutes, temperatures outside the spacecraft would rise to levels capable of melting metal. The heat shield attached to the vehicle's underside would become the only thing standing between the crew and destruction. Mission Control transmitted its final messages. Because of the communication delay, real-time assistance was impossible. For the next several minutes, the astronauts would effectively be alone. Millions of people on Earth watched anxiously. Scientists. Engineers. World leaders. Students. Families. Entire nations waited to learn whether humanity's greatest mission would succeed. Then the spacecraft reached the upper atmosphere. Almost immediately, the first effects became visible. A faint glow appeared outside the windows. As friction increased, that glow rapidly intensified. Soon brilliant streams of plasma surrounded the vehicle. Temperatures outside climbed into the thousands of degrees. The spacecraft began shaking violently. The smooth journey through deep space was over. Now the crew felt every force acting upon the vehicle. The atmosphere was fighting back. The astronauts gripped their seats as vibrations rattled through the cabin. Every bolt, every panel, every component was being tested. The spacecraft plunged deeper. The heat shield absorbed incredible amounts of energy. Outside, the vehicle looked like a meteor blazing across the Martian sky. For several long minutes, communication with Earth became impossible. The plasma surrounding the spacecraft blocked radio signals. Mission Control could do nothing except wait. Across Earth, millions held their breath. No messages arrived. No updates appeared. Only silence. Inside the spacecraft, alarms monitored every critical system. Altitude, velocity, temperature, trajectory. The crew watched carefully as the numbers changed. Everything seemed to be functioning properly. But nobody relaxed. Not yet. The hardest part was still ahead. The atmosphere had slowed the spacecraft significantly, but not enough. They were still traveling at tremendous speed. Soon parachutes would deploy. Then landing engines would ignite. Every step had to happen perfectly. A failure of even one system could end the mission. The astronauts knew it. Mission Control knew it. The entire world knew it. As the spacecraft descended lower and lower, the surface of Mars became visible in incredible detail. Mountains, craters, rock formations, dust-covered plains. For the first time in human history, human eyes were seeing another planet from the perspective of an approaching landing. The dream was becoming reality. Yet reality remained dangerous. The spacecraft continued descending. Velocity dropped. Altitude decreased. Critical systems prepared for the next phase. Within minutes, humanity would discover whether it had successfully reached another world. And somewhere below, hidden among the vast deserts of Mars, the landing site was waiting. The final moments of the descent felt endless. Inside the spacecraft, every astronaut watched the displays in front of them as altitude continued dropping rapidly. The heat shield had done its job. The atmosphere had slowed the vehicle. Now the remaining systems had to finish what the engineers had spent decades preparing for. Then came the next critical event. The supersonic parachute deployed. A violent jolt shook the spacecraft. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Everyone waited. The parachute held. The descent continued. Altitude decreased rapidly. The surface of Mars now appeared incredibly close. The astronauts could see rock scattered across the landscape. Dust-covered plains stretched toward the horizon. Ancient craters cast long shadows beneath the sunlight. For the first time, Mars no longer looked like a planet. It looked like a place. A real place. A world waiting directly beneath them. Soon the parachute was released. Landing engines ignited. Powerful rockets fired beneath the spacecraft, slowing its descent even further. The vehicle hovered briefly above the Martian surface. Dust exploded outward in every direction. Visibility dropped. The astronauts felt the engines making constant adjustments. Every second mattered. Every meter mattered. Then came a moment that humanity had waited centuries to experience. The spacecraft touched down. At first, nobody spoke. The crew simply stared at one another. After years of preparation. After hundreds of days in deep space. After traveling millions of kilometers across the solar system. They had made it. Humanity had reached Mars. Cheers erupted inside Mission Control back on Earth. Engineers embraced. Scientists celebrated. Around the world, billions of people watched history unfold. For the first time, human beings had successfully landed on another planet. Yet even then, the mission was not over. The crew still had to confirm that all systems were functioning correctly. The spacecraft remained sealed while engineers analyzed data from every onboard system. Minutes passed. Then hours. Everything appeared stable. The moment had finally arrived. The astronauts prepared for the first extravehicular activity. The first walk on Mars. One by one, they carefully suited up. Life support systems were checked. Communication equipment was tested. Every procedure was followed exactly. Outside the hatch waited a world no human being had ever touched. The first astronaut slowly approached the exit. Millions watched. Billions waited. The hatch opened. Sunlight flooded into the airlock. Beyond the doorway stretched an endless red landscape. Silence. Dust. rocks. An alien horizon. The astronaut carefully climbed down the ladder. Each movement felt deliberate. Every step carried enormous weight. Not just for the individual making it, but for all of humanity. The boot moved closer and closer to the surface. Then, finally, it touched the ground. Humanity had arrived. The first footprint pressed into the Martian soil. A mark unlike any other in history. For hundreds of thousands of years, human beings had walked across Earth. Only a handful had walked on the Moon. Now, for the very first time, humans stood on Mars. The crew soon joined one another outside. Together they looked across the landscape. The sky appeared different from Earth. The sunlight felt different. Even the horizon seemed unfamiliar. Everything about Mars reminded them that they were somewhere entirely new. For a few moments, nobody focused on equipment or procedures. They simply stood there. Looking. Listening. Experiencing a moment that generations had dreamed about. Yet beneath the excitement was another realization. Getting to Mars had been difficult. Surviving on Mars would be much harder. The first footprints had been made. Now humanity faced an even greater challenge. Building a life on another world. The excitement of the landing quickly gave way to reality. Standing on Mars was an extraordinary achievement, but the crew knew that simply arriving was not enough. Unlike the Apollo astronauts who spent only a short time on the Moon before returning home, these explorers intended to stay. Their survival depended on transforming a hostile landscape into a place where humans could live and work. Within hours of landing, the crew began unloading equipment from the spacecraft. Habitat modules, power systems, scientific instruments, communication arrays, and life support equipment all had to be deployed. Every task followed a carefully designed schedule. Mars was beautiful, but it was also deadly. The thin atmosphere provided almost no protection from radiation. Temperatures could drop to levels capable of freezing exposed equipment. Dust covered everything. Even a small mistake could become a serious threat. The first habitat was modest by Earth standards, but on Mars it represented something extraordinary. It was the first permanent human structure ever built on another planet. As inflatable sections expanded and support systems came online, the astronauts watched their future take shape. Solar panels stretched across the red landscape, converting sunlight into precious electricity. Communication antennas connected the base to Earth. Scientific stations began collecting data from the surrounding environment. Slowly, the empty desert transformed into humanity's first foothold on another world. Every day brought new challenges. Equipment needed maintenance. Dust accumulated on solar panels. Air filters required constant attention. The crew worked long hours because they understood the importance of what they were building. They were not merely constructing a base for themselves. They were creating the foundation for future generations of explorers. One day, more spacecraft would arrive. More habitats would be built. Entire communities might eventually grow where only dust and rocks existed today. Yet despite their progress, the crew could never fully relax. Beyond the walls of the habitat remained one of the most hostile environments humans had ever encountered. Every breath depended on machines. Every drop of water depended on technology. Every moment of survival depended on systems functioning perfectly. Mars constantly reminded them that they were visitors in a world not meant for human life. And as the days passed, the astronauts began realizing that building the base was only the beginning. The far greater challenge would be keeping it alive. Life on Mars quickly became a constant battle against the planet itself. Every time an astronaut stepped outside the habitat, they entered an environment that could kill them within seconds if their suit failed. The atmosphere was too thin to breathe, temperatures regularly plunged far below freezing, and harmful radiation constantly reached the surface. Even the dust presented a serious threat. Unlike ordinary dust on Earth, Martian dust was extremely fine and abrasive, capable of damaging equipment, clogging filters, and wearing down critical systems over time. The crew soon realized that survival depended on endless maintenance. Every day, solar panels had to be cleaned, life support systems had to be inspected, and habitat structures had to be monitored for damage. Small problems could quickly become major emergencies. A leaking air seal, a malfunctioning water recycler, or a damaged power cable could threaten the entire mission. Yet despite these dangers, the astronauts slowly adapted. Humans have an extraordinary ability to survive in difficult environments. What initially felt alien gradually became familiar. The red deserts, the pale sky, and the endless silence became part of everyday life. Still, the crew never forgot one important fact. Mars was not trying to help them survive. Every day they remained alive was a victory against a planet that seemed determined to make survival impossible. Among all the challenges facing the first Martian settlers, one resource quickly became more important than any other: water. On Earth, most people rarely think about it. Clean water flows from taps, fills lakes and rivers, and falls from the sky as rain. On Mars, every drop was precious. The crew arrived with limited reserves, but they knew those supplies would never last forever. If humanity hoped to survive on another planet, it would need to find water locally. Scientists had already discovered evidence of frozen water hidden beneath the Martian surface, but accessing it was far from simple. Powerful drilling equipment was deployed near the base, and day after day the astronauts worked to extract ice buried beneath layers of dust and rock. Success would mean drinking water, oxygen production, food cultivation, and possibly even fuel for future spacecraft. Failure could threaten the entire colony. The operation became one of the most important projects ever attempted on Mars. Then, after weeks of effort, the first significant deposits were successfully extracted. The discovery was celebrated across Earth. It was more than just water. It was proof that humans could use the resources of another world to support themselves. For the first time, the dream of a permanent settlement seemed truly possible. Yet the victory came with another realization. Surviving on Mars would require constant expansion, constant innovation, and constant problem-solving. Every success revealed a new challenge waiting just beyond the horizon. Water was only part of the equation. The crew still faced another critical challenge: air. Every breath taken inside the habitat depended on a complex network of machines working around the clock. Unlike Earth, Mars offered no natural supply of breathable oxygen. The atmosphere was composed mostly of carbon dioxide, making it useless for human survival. Fortunately, scientists had spent years developing technology designed specifically for this problem. Large processing units were installed near the base, pulling in the thin Martian air and separating oxygen from carbon dioxide. At first, production levels were small. Every gram of oxygen generated was carefully measured and monitored. But as the systems improved, output steadily increased. Soon the astronauts were breathing air produced directly from the resources of another planet. It was a historic achievement. For the first time in human history, people were creating the oxygen needed for survival on a world beyond Earth. The success dramatically reduced dependence on supplies from home and proved that future colonies might one day become self-sustaining. Yet the machines required constant maintenance, and a major failure could quickly become catastrophic. Every day, engineers inspected filters, pumps, valves, and power systems. There was no room for complacency. On Mars, something as simple as breathing remained one of the greatest technological challenges humanity had ever faced. While oxygen and water were essential for survival, neither could solve another problem that became more serious with each passing month. Food. The first settlers had arrived on Mars carrying enough supplies to survive for a long time, but everyone understood that stored food was only a temporary solution. If humanity hoped to establish a permanent presence on another planet, it would eventually need to grow its own crops. On Earth, agriculture had developed over thousands of years beneath open skies, fertile soil, flowing rivers, and a stable atmosphere. Mars offered none of those advantages. The soil contained toxic chemicals known as perchlorates. The temperatures were extremely cold. Sunlight reaching the surface was weaker than on Earth. Outside the habitat, plants would die almost immediately. To overcome these obstacles, the crew constructed specialized greenhouse modules connected directly to the base. Inside, Temperature, humidity, lighting, and atmospheric conditions were carefully controlled by computers. Every seed planted represented more than food. It represented independence. It represented the possibility that humans could truly live beyond Earth. The first crops were small. Lettuce, potatoes, tomatoes, and other fast-growing plants were chosen because they required relatively little space and could provide valuable nutrition. Every day, astronauts checked growth rates, adjusted lighting systems, and monitored water consumption. Weeks passed. Then one morning, something extraordinary happened. Tiny green shoots emerged from the growing beds. Against all odds, life from Earth had begun growing on another world. The discovery created excitement throughout the colony. For the first time, the astronauts could see living plants developing beneath the red skies of Mars. The psychological effect was almost as important as the food itself. After months surrounded by metal walls, machines, and endless deserts, seeing something green brought a sense of comfort that nobody had expected. The greenhouse quickly became one of the most popular locations in the entire settlement. Crew members often visited simply to spend time near living things. As the months passed, the harvests improved. The settlers produced increasing amounts of fresh food, reducing their dependence on Earth. Yet even this success revealed another harsh reality. Every aspect of life on Mars remained fragile. A power outage could destroy entire crops. A failure in the water system could wipe out months of work. One serious accident could threaten the food supply of the entire colony. Survival still depended on technology functioning perfectly every day. Nevertheless, humanity had achieved something remarkable. For the first time in history, people were not merely surviving on another planet. They were growing life there. The dream of a self-sustaining Martian settlement no longer seemed impossible. But while crops flourished inside the greenhouse, outside the habitat a far greater threat was beginning to emerge across the Martian horizon. A threat capable of endangering the entire colony. A threat that every Mars mission had feared from the beginning. The dust storms were coming. At first, the warning signs seemed insignificant. Instruments positioned around the colony detected small changes in atmospheric pressure. Winds that were normally gentle began growing stronger. Tiny clouds of dust appeared on the horizon. Similar events had happened before, and nobody was overly concerned. Mars was famous for its dust storms. In fact, some had been observed from Earth long before humans ever arrived on the planet. But over the following days, something unusual began happening. The storm did not weaken. It continued growing. Satellite imagery revealed enormous walls of dust moving across the landscape. Hundreds of kilometers wide. Then thousands. Soon the crew realized they were witnessing one of the largest weather events ever recorded on Mars. The sky gradually darkened as fine red dust filled the atmosphere. Sunlight reaching the surface began decreasing dramatically. Visibility dropped. Solar panels that powered much of the colony produced less and less electricity with each passing day. Suddenly, the settlement faced a serious threat. The storm itself would not tear buildings apart like a hurricane on Earth. The atmosphere of Mars was too thin for that. The real danger came from what the dust could do over time. It covered solar panels. It infiltrated machinery. It damaged seals and moving parts. It reduced power generation exactly when the colony needed it most. The crew immediately entered emergency procedures. Non-essential systems were shut down to conserve energy. Scientific operations were suspended. Every available astronaut worked to protect critical equipment. Outside, conditions became increasingly hostile. Dust covered everything. The landscape disappeared beneath a red haze. Even simple maintenance tasks became difficult and dangerous. Yet the storm continued growing stronger. Days passed. Then weeks. The settlers began experiencing something few people on Earth could truly understand. They were trapped on another world while a planet-wide weather event unfolded around them. Communication remained operational, but there was little Earth could do. The colony was simply too far away. If the situation became catastrophic, no rescue mission could arrive in time. For the first time since landing, many members of the crew were forced to confront a frightening reality. They were completely on their own. Every decision mattered. Every watt of power mattered. Every piece of equipment mattered. The colony's survival depended entirely on the people living inside it. As power reserves slowly declined, tension increased throughout the base. Engineers worked around the clock searching for solutions. Backup energy systems were activated. Batteries were carefully managed. Every resource was rationed. Then, just when the situation seemed most dangerous, the storm finally began showing signs of weakening. Slowly, sunlight returned. Dust concentrations decreased. The horizon became visible again. One morning, after weeks of darkness, the crew watched as sunlight illuminated the Martian landscape once more. The colony had survived. It was a tremendous victory, but also an important lesson. Mars had reminded humanity that it remained an unforgiving world. A single storm had nearly crippled the settlement. Future colonies would need stronger power systems, better protection, and greater independence if they hoped to survive for generations. The astronauts celebrated their success, but they also understood something else. If a dust storm could create this much trouble, what would happen when an even bigger crisis arrived? As the months turned into years, life on Mars slowly stopped feeling like a mission and started feeling like reality. The excitement of being the first humans on another planet had not disappeared, but it was no longer the center of daily life. Instead, the settlers found themselves dealing with ordinary problems in an extraordinary place. They woke up each morning, checked equipment, repaired systems, monitored crops, cleaned habitats, and planned future construction projects. In many ways, it resembled life in a remote research station on Earth. But there was one crucial difference. On Earth, if something went wrong, help was never very far away. On Mars, help was millions of kilometers distant. Every task carried consequences. Every decision carried risks. The settlers began noticing subtle changes in themselves. Some had not seen a natural ocean in years. Others could barely remember the feeling of rain falling on their skin. Children born in future Martian colonies might never experience those things at all. Even time itself felt different. A Martian day is slightly longer than a day on Earth, and over time the settlers adapted to that rhythm. The red deserts outside the habitat became familiar. The pale salmon-colored sky no longer seemed strange. In fact, some astronauts admitted they felt more comfortable on Mars than they did when watching videos of Earth. The planet was slowly becoming home. Yet despite this growing sense of belonging, reality remained harsh. Every breath still depended on machines. Every meal still depended on technology. Every drop of water still required processing and recycling. The colony had become stronger since the day of the landing, but it was still fragile. A major systems failure could threaten everyone. The settlers often found themselves wondering about the future. Would cities eventually rise where only dust existed today? Would millions of people someday call Mars home? Would children grow up beneath these red skies and consider Earth a distant ancestral world? The possibility felt less like science fiction with every passing year. Yet there was another question that lingered in the minds of the first settlers. A question nobody liked discussing openly. A question that had followed them since the beginning of the mission. What if they never returned home? At first, everyone assumed the answer would eventually be simple. Build the colony. Produce fuel. Prepare a spacecraft. Return to Earth. But as time passed, the situation became increasingly complicated. New problems appeared. New delays emerged. New realities became impossible to ignore. The settlers were beginning to understand something that mission planners had feared from the start. Reaching Mars was incredibly difficult. Leaving it again might be even harder. Nobody expected homesickness to become one of the colony's greatest challenges. After all, these astronauts had volunteered for the mission. They had trained for years. They understood the risks. They knew they would spend a long time away from Earth. Yet understanding something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally are two very different things. As the years passed, many settlers found themselves thinking about Earth more often than ever before. Not because they regretted coming to Mars, but because distance has a strange effect on memory. The further away they traveled, the more valuable ordinary things seemed. They missed the sound of rain hitting a window. They missed walking beneath trees moving in the wind. They missed oceans stretching toward the horizon. They missed birds, rivers, thunderstorms, and even simple things like grass beneath their feet. On Earth, these experiences had been so common that most people barely noticed them. On Mars, they felt priceless. Some settlers spent hours watching old videos recorded before launch. Family gatherings. City streets. Beaches. Forest sunsets over oceans. The images often felt almost unreal. Earth no longer seemed like a place they had left behind. It felt like another world entirely. Communication with home remained possible, but it was never easy. Messages often took many minutes to arrive. Real conversations became impossible. The natural flow of human interaction disappeared. Birthdays were missed. Weddings happened without them. Children grew older while they watched through screens. Parents aged. Friends moved on with their lives. The settlers gradually realized that while they had been building a future on Mars, life on Earth had continued without them. This realization was sometimes painful. Yet it also strengthened their sense of purpose. The colony was no longer simply an experiment. It was becoming a community. The settlers celebrated holidays together. They created traditions unique to Mars. They shared meals grown inside the greenhouses. They marked anniversaries of the landing. Slowly, a new culture began emerging beneath the red skies. The first Martians were being born, not biologically yet, but psychologically. Their identity was beginning to change. They still loved Earth. They still considered it humanity's home. But Mars was becoming home as well. And with every passing year, another uncomfortable truth became more difficult to ignore. The longer they stayed, the harder it would be to leave. Their bodies were adapting to Martian gravity. Their lives were becoming rooted in the colony. Their responsibilities continued growing. What had once been a temporary mission was slowly transforming into something much larger. For the first time, some settlers began asking a question that nobody had seriously considered before. If a return mission became possible tomorrow, would everyone actually choose to go? Or had Mars already started changing them into something new? For years, the colony had survived through discipline, preparation, and a little bit of luck. The settlers had endured dust storms, isolation, equipment failures, and the countless small challenges that came with living on another world. But every experienced engineer knew the same truth: complex systems do not fail all at once. They fail gradually. One small problem leads to another. A damaged component puts extra stress on a backup system. A delayed repair creates a new weakness somewhere else. Eventually, tiny issues begin connecting together until they become something much larger. The first signs appeared in the colony's power infrastructure. Some of the original equipment brought from Earth had been operating continuously for years. Parts were wearing out faster than expected. Solar panels had suffered damage from dust and temperature extremes. Batteries were losing efficiency. Nothing seemed catastrophic at first, but the margin for error was shrinking. Then came a series of unexpected failures. A power regulator malfunctioned. A water processing unit shut down unexpectedly. Several greenhouse systems experienced interruptions. Each problem was solved individually, but together they painted a troubling picture. The colony was aging. Unlike Earth, where replacement parts could arrive within days, Mars existed millions of kilometers away from the nearest supply chain. Every broken component mattered. Every repair consumed valuable resources. Every decision carried long-term consequences. The settlers worked tirelessly to keep everything operational, but the pressure was growing. Some systems had been designed to last for years, not decades. Others were now operating beyond their original specifications. Engineers began prioritizing critical infrastructure over scientific projects. Expansion plans were postponed. Construction of new habitat modules slowed. Survival had once again become the primary objective. Then one evening, a more serious incident occurred. A section of the habitat detected a sudden pressure loss. Emergency alarms echoed through the colony. Bulkhead doors sealed automatically. Crew members rushed to identify the source of the leak. For several tense hours, nobody knew whether the damage was minor or potentially fatal. In the end, the leak was contained and repaired, but the event shook everyone. It served as a reminder that despite all their achievements, they were still living inside fragile structures surrounded by a world that wanted them dead. One damaged seal. One failed system. One unlucky accident. Sometimes the difference between survival and disaster was measured in seconds. As months passed, the settlers noticed another change. Conversations about returning to Earth became less frequent. Not because people had forgotten home, but because daily survival demanded so much attention. The colony required constant effort just to remain functional. Every year brought new repairs, new challenges, and new responsibilities. Mars was slowly consuming their time, their energy, and their future. What had once been a temporary mission now felt increasingly permanent. Yet even as problems accumulated, a larger question loomed over everything. Could they actually leave if they wanted to? The answer was becoming more complicated with every passing year. Because the greatest obstacle facing the settlers was not a storm, a system failure, or even the Martian environment itself. It was the simple reality that getting to Mars had been difficult. Getting off Mars might be nearly impossible. The longer the colony survived, the more the settlers came to understand a simple but uncomfortable truth: they were not living on Mars. They were living inside technology. Every wall surrounding them, every machine producing oxygen, every system recycling water, every greenhouse growing food, and every power generator keeping the lights on existed between them and certain death. On Earth, people rarely think about the infrastructure supporting their lives. If electricity fails, help usually arrives quickly. If a water pipe breaks, replacement parts can be ordered. If a hospital is needed, one is often only minutes away. Mars offered none of those luxuries. The settlers existed inside an isolated bubble of human engineering surrounded by a world completely hostile to their survival. Over time, this reality became impossible to ignore. Machines that once seemed reliable began showing their age. Bearings wore down. Electronics degraded under constant exposure to radiation. Seals became brittle after years of temperature fluctuations. Every system required maintenance, and maintenance required parts. But replacement parts were limited. The colony could manufacture some components locally, but many remained impossible to produce with existing technology. As a result, engineers often found themselves making difficult decisions. Should a spare part be used now or saved for a future emergency? Should a failing system be repaired or replaced entirely? How long could equipment continue operating beyond its original lifespan? These questions became increasingly important as the years passed. Then another problem emerged. The colony had been designed by people on Earth who had never actually lived on Mars. Many systems performed differently than expected. Some lasted longer than predicted. Others failed much sooner. Engineers constantly revised procedures as they learned what truly worked in the Martian environment. Every lesson improved the colony's chances of survival, but each lesson often came at a cost. A damaged greenhouse. A failed battery system. A communications outage. Small mistakes that would be inconveniences on Earth became major events on Mars. The settlers also discovered a deeper psychological challenge. They could never fully relax. Somewhere in the back of every person's mind existed an awareness that their survival depended on thousands of components functioning correctly every second of every day. A tiny crack in a pressure vessel. A software error. A damaged valve. Any one of these could potentially become catastrophic. Yet despite this constant pressure, the colony continued growing. Humans adapted as they always had. Children born in future generations would likely view these dangers differently. For them, Mars would simply be home. But for the first settlers, every day served as a reminder of how fragile their existence truly was. And as engineers examined the aging infrastructure, another troubling realization began spreading through the colony. The technology keeping them alive was becoming harder to maintain. The years were passing. Equipment was wearing out. Resources were limited. And if building a permanent settlement was difficult, preparing a spacecraft capable of carrying humans all the way back to Earth might be even harder. The dream of returning home was beginning to collide with reality. Whenever people on Earth imagined the first Mars colony, they often assumed that if something went terribly wrong, another mission could simply be launched to help. After all, that is how problems are solved on Earth. If a town experiences a disaster, aid arrives. If a ship is in trouble, rescue teams respond. If a space station experiences an emergency, support missions can often be organized. Mars changes all of those assumptions. The settlers slowly came to understand that one of the most frightening realities of their new world was not the environment itself, but the distance separating them from everyone else. At its closest point, Mars is tens of millions of kilometers away from Earth. At its farthest, the distance can exceed 400 million kilometers. Even with advanced spacecraft, a journey between the two planets takes many months. There are no emergency helicopters. No rescue boats. No rapid response teams. If a serious crisis occurred, help could not arrive tomorrow, next week, or even next month. It might take an entire year before another crew could reach them. This reality affected every aspect of colony planning. The settlers could not rely on rescue. They had to rely on themselves. Every critical system required backups. Every backup required another backup. Medical supplies had to cover years rather than weeks. Engineers needed the ability to repair equipment that had never been designed to be repaired. Doctors had to handle situations normally requiring entire hospitals. Every member of the colony carried responsibilities far beyond their original profession because on Mars, specialization alone was not enough. Everyone had to become a problem solver. The challenge became even more serious when orbital mechanics were considered. Earth and Mars do not remain the same distance apart. The planets constantly move around the Sun. There are periods when launching a mission is relatively efficient and other periods when doing so becomes far more difficult. Missing one launch window could delay a rescue mission by many months. In some cases, the people needing help might not survive long enough for assistance to arrive. This terrifying reality forced the settlers to think differently than any explorers before them. They were not temporary visitors waiting for support. They were the support. Every problem would ultimately be solved by the people already living on Mars. As years passed, this realization fundamentally changed the colony's culture. The settlers became increasingly independent. They developed new technologies, new manufacturing methods, and new emergency procedures specifically because they could not depend on Earth. Ironically, the farther away they were from humanity's home planet, the more self-sufficient they became. Yet this growing independence revealed another uncomfortable truth. If rescue was almost impossible, returning home might be just as difficult. The colony had spent years focusing on survival, expansion, and adaptation. Meanwhile, the dream of returning to Earth remained exactly that, a dream. Because leaving Mars would require solving one of the greatest engineering challenges in human history. And with every passing year, that challenge seemed to grow larger. When most people imagine a mission to Mars, they focus on the journey there. The launch. The landing. The first footsteps on the red planet. But very few stop to think about what may be the most difficult part of the entire mission, leaving Mars. Getting to another planet is an extraordinary challenge, but getting back requires an entirely different level of planning. Every kilogram of fuel needed for the return trip must either be transported from Earth at enormous cost or somehow produced on Mars itself. At first, the settlers believed this problem could eventually be solved. Engineers had developed technologies capable of converting Martian resources into rocket fuel. Water extracted from underground ice could be separated into hydrogen and oxygen. Carbon dioxide from the atmosphere could be processed into methane. On paper, the plan seemed brilliant. In reality, it proved far more difficult. Producing enough fuel for a return mission required massive amounts of energy, equipment, maintenance, and time. Every machine involved in the process had to function perfectly for years. A single failure could delay production for months. The colony soon realized that simply surviving on Mars consumed most of its available resources. Power systems were needed to support life support equipment, greenhouses, communications, manufacturing facilities, and habitat expansion. Fuel production constantly competed with these priorities. Every watt of electricity directed toward making rocket fuel was electricity that could not be used elsewhere. Then there was the issue of scale. Returning a crew safely to Earth required enormous quantities of fuel. Far more than many people realized. Building a rocket on Mars was difficult enough. Filling that rocket with enough fuel to escape the planet's gravity, enter interplanetary space, and complete the journey home was another challenge entirely. Years passed, and fuel reserves grew more slowly than expected. Equipment degraded. Production targets were missed. New technical problems emerged. The settlers continued working, but the dream of a return mission began slipping farther into the future. Some members of the colony started questioning whether it made sense at all. Why invest so many resources into leaving when those same resources could strengthen the colony itself? Why risk a dangerous return journey after spending years building a new life on Mars? The debate grew increasingly common. For some settlers, Earth remained home. For others, Mars was becoming the future. Yet regardless of personal opinions, the numbers were impossible to ignore. Every year spent on Mars made returning more complicated. Equipment aged. Infrastructure expanded. Responsibilities increased. And while fuel production continued, it never seemed to advance quickly enough. Slowly, an unsettling possibility emerged. Perhaps the first humans on Mars would not be the first humans to return from Mars. Perhaps they would become something else entirely. Not visitors. Not astronauts. But permanent settlers living on a world that was never meant to be theirs. And if that possibility was true, then an even more uncomfortable question remained. If a return mission could eventually be built, would it actually be worth the risk? For many years, the settlers comforted themselves with a simple idea. No matter how difficult life became on Mars, Earth would always be waiting for them. The blue planet remained visible in photographs, messages continued arriving from family and friends, and mission planners constantly discussed future return opportunities. Yet as time passed, a harsh reality began emerging. Returning home was not simply a technical problem. It was a human one. The cost of returning grew larger every year. Some of that cost could be measured in fuel, equipment, and resources. But much of it could not. By now, the settlers had spent a significant portion of their lives on Mars. They had built habitats, expanded greenhouses, established power systems, and transformed a small landing site into the beginnings of a permanent settlement. Their work had become essential to the survival of the colony. If they left, who would replace them? New arrivals from Earth could help, but experience could not be transferred overnight. Every year spent on Mars created stronger connections to the colony and weaker connections to the world they had left behind. Family members on Earth had grown older. Some had passed away. Children had become adults. Entire chapters of life had unfolded while the settlers watched from millions of kilometers away. In many cases, the Earth they remembered no longer existed. Technology had changed. Cities had changed. Society had changed. The longer they remained on Mars, the more Earth transformed into a memory rather than a destination. There was also the physical cost. Years in lower Martian gravity had altered their bodies. Scientists worried that some settlers might struggle to readapt to Earth's much stronger gravity. Muscles, bones, and cardiovascular systems had all adjusted to life on Mars. Returning home could require years of rehabilitation, and even then, there were no guarantees. Some medical experts believed certain settlers might never fully recover. The irony was difficult to ignore. Humanity had spent generations dreaming about reaching another world, only to discover that living there might permanently change the people who succeeded. Then there was the risk itself. A return mission would require launching from Mars, traveling through deep space once again, surviving months of exposure to radiation, and safely entering Earth's atmosphere. Every stage carried danger. Every stage offered opportunities for failure. Some settlers quietly asked themselves whether risking everything for a return journey truly made sense. They had already survived the impossible. Why gamble their lives on another mission when they had successfully built a future where they already stood? Over time, conversations throughout the colony began changing. At first, people spoke about when they would return. Later, they spoke about whether they would return. Eventually, some stopped discussing the subject altogether. A generation of pioneers had arrived on Mars believing they were temporary visitors. Now many were beginning to suspect they might be something else entirely. The colony no longer felt like an outpost. It felt like a home. And perhaps the most surprising realization of all was that some settlers were no longer afraid of that possibility. The idea of spending the rest of their lives beneath the red skies of Mars no longer seemed tragic. It seemed realistic. Yet one final question still remained. If returning home was becoming less likely, what did that mean for the future of humanity itself? For decades before the first launch, politicians, engineers, scientists, and journalists repeatedly described Mars as humanity's next great destination. The phrase sounded inspiring. It appeared in speeches, documentaries, and mission plans around the world. Yet very few people wanted to discuss a possibility that became increasingly obvious as the years passed. What if Mars was not a destination at all? What if it was a one-way journey? The settlers had spent years convincing themselves that returning to Earth remained a realistic possibility. It helped them cope with the distance. It helped them accept the risks. It provided comfort during difficult times. But now the facts were becoming impossible to ignore. The colony depended on infrastructure that required constant attention. Fuel production remained slower than expected. Equipment continued aging. New settlers arriving from Earth increasingly viewed Mars as a permanent home rather than a temporary outpost. The mission itself was evolving into something nobody had originally planned. Humanity was no longer exploring Mars. Humanity was settling Mars. The difference between those two ideas was enormous. Explorers intend to return. Settlers intend to stay. As this realization spread through the colony, people reacted in different ways. Some struggled with it. They had always imagined seeing Earth again. They missed family, familiar landscapes, and the simple comfort of knowing home was nearby. Others gradually accepted the reality. After all, they had already spent years building a life beneath the red skies of another planet. Their friends were here. Their work was here. Their future was here. Many had become more connected to the colony than to the world they had left behind. The emotional divide grew larger with each passing year. Meanwhile, a new generation began arriving. These newcomers viewed Mars differently. They did not see it as a temporary mission. They saw opportunity. They saw the chance to build something entirely new. For them, Mars was not a place to visit. It was a place to live. This shift in perspective transformed the colony. Expansion projects accelerated. New habitats were constructed. Additional greenhouses appeared across the settlement. Manufacturing facilities grew larger and more capable. The colony was no longer preparing for departure. It was preparing for permanence. And yet, the most profound change was psychological. The settlers slowly stopped measuring time by how long they had been away from Earth. Instead, they measured it by how long they had been on Mars. Anniversaries of the landing became more important than memories of launch day. New traditions replaced old ones. A distinct Martian identity began emerging. Humanity was adapting once again, just as it always had throughout history. But this adaptation came with a difficult truth. The first humans on Mars might never leave. Not because they were trapped. Not because they had failed, but because staying had become the more practical choice. The colony needed them. Their lives existed there. Their future existed there. And perhaps most surprisingly, many no longer wanted to leave. What had started as humanity's greatest voyage of exploration was quietly becoming something much larger. The birth of a second branch of human civilization. A civilization that might one day look back at Earth the same way ancient explorers once looked back at distant homelands across the sea. At some point, without anyone noticing exactly when it happened, the settlers stopped thinking of themselves as visitors. The change was gradual. There was no ceremony. No official declaration. No single moment when someone stood up and announced that Mars was now home. Instead, it happened through thousands of ordinary experiences spread across many years. The red landscape outside the habitat stopped looking alien. The pale orange sky became familiar. Dust storms became seasonal events rather than terrifying surprises. New arrivals from Earth often spoke about how strange Mars felt, but the original settlers found themselves struggling to relate. They had lived there for so long that the planet no longer seemed unusual. In many ways, Earth now felt more foreign than Mars. This transformation extended far beyond simple emotions. The colony was developing its own culture. New traditions emerged. New holidays were celebrated. Stories about the first landing were told the same way frontier communities on Earth once told stories about their founders. Children growing up in the colony learned about Earth in school, but their daily lives revolved around Mars. They knew the local geography. They understood the rhythms of the Martian seasons. They could identify nearby valleys, craters, and landmarks the same way children on Earth recognized mountains or rivers near their homes. Even language began changing. New words and expressions appeared as settlers adapted to realities unique to life on another planet. Scientists studying the colony noticed something fascinating. The first generation had come to Mars as Earthlings trying to survive. The next generation was growing up as Martians learning about Earth. It was a subtle difference, but a profound one. Humanity was beginning to divide not by nationality, politics, or geography, but by planet. The psychological shift carried enormous consequences. The idea of returning to Earth no longer felt universal. Some settlers still dreamed about it, but others questioned why they would leave. Everything important in their lives existed on Mars. Their careers, friendships, responsibilities, and memories were tied to the colony. Some had spent so many years beneath the red skies that Earth existed primarily through photographs and delayed messages. The planet of their birth remained important, but it no longer defined who they were. Mars did. As the colony expanded, this new identity only grew stronger. Additional habitats were constructed. Greenhouses multiplied. Industrial facilities became more sophisticated. Scientific research accelerated. What had once been a tiny settlement was evolving into the foundation of a permanent civilization. The first settlers watched these changes with a mixture of pride and disbelief. They had arrived expecting to explore another world. Instead, they were helping create one. Yet as humanity's future on Mars became increasingly secure, another reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The longer the colony survived, the less likely it seemed that its founders would ever leave. Mars had changed them. Not just physically, but emotionally, culturally, and psychologically. They were becoming something history had never seen before. The first people whose true home existed on another planet. As the colony continued growing, a strange possibility emerged, one that would have sounded unbelievable to the first settlers when they originally left Earth. There might come a day when some humans had never seen the planet where their species was born. The first generation still remembered Earth vividly. They remembered blue oceans stretching beyond the horizon, green forests moving in the wind, thunderstorms rolling across distant mountains, and cities glowing beneath the night sky. Those memories stayed with them no matter how many years they spent on Mars. But the generations that followed would be different. Children born in the colony would know Earth only through stories, photographs, recordings, and lessons taught in school. They would learn about oceans the same way children on Earth learn about ancient civilizations, something fascinating, important and real, yet distant from everyday life. For them, Mars would not feel like a harsh frontier. It would feel normal. The lower gravity would be normal. The red deserts would be normal. The enclosed habitats, artificial ecosystems, and underground living spaces would be normal. In fact, Earth might seem far stranger to them than Mars ever did. Scientists began considering an uncomfortable biological reality as well. Humans who spent their entire lives in Martian gravity might find it extremely difficult, or even impossible, to adapt to Earth's much stronger gravitational pull. Their bones, muscles, and cardiovascular systems would develop differently. A child raised on Mars might dream of visiting Earth one day, only to discover that their body was physically incapable of handling the journey. In a cruel twist of fate, descendants of Earth's explorers could become permanent residents of another planet not by choice, but by biology. The cultural consequences were equally profound. As generations passed, Mars would inevitably develop its own traditions, values, identities, and ways of life. Historical events important to Earth might feel less relevant to people living millions of kilometers away. New holidays would emerge. New heroes would be celebrated. New myths and legends would be born from the challenges of surviving on another world. Humanity would remain one species, but it would no longer share a single home. For thousands of years, every human story began on Earth. Now that was changing. The settlers often looked at the bright star hanging in the Martian sky and thought about this future. Somewhere within that point of light existed the birthplace of humanity. Yet for future generations, it might become something else entirely, a distant ancestral world known mostly through history books. The first settlers had left Earth expecting to explore Mars. Instead, they had started a process that could ultimately transform human civilization forever. And perhaps the most extraordinary part of all was that nobody could stop it. Once humanity established roots on another planet, history would never move backward. The future would belong to two worlds instead of one. Yet despite all the progress, all the growth, and all the dreams of a thriving Martian civilization, one final truth remained. The original settlers had come to Mars believing they would eventually return home. Decades later, many were beginning to understand that home was no longer behind them. Home was exactly where they stood. In the end, the greatest surprise was not that humanity reached Mars. The greatest surprise was what happened afterward. For generations, people imagined Mars as a destination. A place to visit. A place to explore. A place where brave astronauts would plant a flag, conduct experiments, and eventually return home as heroes. But reality turned out to be far more complicated. The first settlers discovered that Mars changes everything. It changes how people think, how they live, how they see themselves, and how they imagine the future. Every year spent beneath the red skies made Earth feel farther away. Every habitat constructed, every greenhouse expanded, every child raised in the colony strengthened humanity's connection to its new world. The settlers had originally counted the days until they could return home. Then they counted the years they had survived on Mars. Eventually, many stopped counting altogether. Because somewhere along the way, they realized a profound truth. Mars was no longer a mission. It was a civilization. Returning to Earth remained technically possible for some, at least in theory. But theory and reality are rarely the same. The enormous fuel requirements, the dangers of deep space travel, the physical effects of long-term exposure to lower gravity, the responsibilities of maintaining the colony, and the simple passage of time all combined into a single unavoidable conclusion. The first humans on Mars were unlikely to leave. Not because they had failed. Not because they were trapped. But because they had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. They had done something far more important than returning home. They had created a new home. The red deserts that once seemed hostile had become familiar. The colony that began as a collection of fragile structures had become a thriving settlement. The people who arrived as astronauts had become pioneers, builders, leaders, and founders. History would remember them not as visitors, but as the first Martians. One evening, many years after the original landing, an elderly member of the first crew stood outside the habitat wearing a modern exploration suit. Above him stretched the stars of the Martian night. In the distance, the lights of the growing colony illuminated the landscape. Somewhere high above the horizon shone a tiny blue-white star. Earth. The world where humanity began. The astronaut stared at it for a long time. That distant point contained every memory of his childhood, every street he had once walked, every ocean he had once seen, and every dream that had ultimately brought him here. Yet despite all those memories, he felt no sadness. Only gratitude. Humanity had always been a species of explorers. Our ancestors crossed deserts, oceans, mountains, and continents searching for a better future. The journey to Mars was simply the next chapter in that story. And perhaps that had been the true purpose of the mission all along. Not to visit another world. Not to return home. But to ensure that humanity would never again belong to only one planet. The first humans reached Mars expecting to come back. Instead, they became the bridge between two worlds. And because of them, the future of our species would stretch farther into the universe than anyone had ever imagined. If there's one lesson we can take from this story, it's that exploration has never been about taking the easy path. Every great leap in human history required people willing to leave behind the familiar and step into the unknown. The first humans on Mars may discover that returning to Earth is far harder than anyone expected. They may spend the rest of their lives beneath red skies millions of kilometers from the world where they were born. But if that happens, their sacrifice will not be remembered as a failure. It will be remembered as the moment humanity became something more. The moment we stopped being a civilization confined to a single planet and began our journey into the stars. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join us for more stories about space, history, and the future of humanity. Until next time, keep looking up.